So the four commanders that make up this army is Godfrey of Bouillon, who's the Duke of Lower Lorraine, certainly very French. Raymond of Toulouse, certainly very French. Robert, Duke of Normandy, mostly French. That was a little tougher. And Robert, Count of Flanders. So these are all kind of equal commanders. It's not even clear that there was a central commander. They were just leading the four armies that were going to take Jerusalem. It's a 5-week siege. It does not go quickly. It does not go easily. As I said, Jerusalem is very heavily fortified. If you saw the movie The Kingdom of Heaven, which is not 100% historically accurate, but is probably 80% historically accurate, you get some idea how difficult it would have been to take Jerusalem back at that time. 5-week siege. Crusader army keeps getting beaten. They keep attacking the walls. They keep getting beaten back. They're out in the desert. Jerusalem's in the middle of the desert. So they don't have water. They don't have wood. You know, they want to build those siege towers and whatnot, but there's no wood. So they have some problems. No food. They make repeated attacks and they fail. But in time, supplies arrived via Jaffa. Wood was brought in from the Judean countryside. They start to build these siege engines and siege towers. Was it the third Tolkien movie that they had the big catapults in and all that? Gives you, I mean, these were monster machines. On July 8th, a Christian cleric, whose name I have never been able to find, has a vision. And he says if the Crusader army marches around the walls of Jerusalem barefoot, then they will be able to take the city. So the Crusader army, they take off their shoes and they march around the walls. If you've ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and you remember the insults hurled from the tower, this is how the Muslims reacted to the Crusader army marching around barefoot around the city. They might have laughed a little too soon. I'm not saying the Crusaders won because they did this, but they did win. And the Muslims were not yucking it up a few days later. The final thing that happened, and depending whether you view Peter the Hermit as a hero or as a nutcase, will depend whether you view that this was the key event that turned the tide. On the Mount of Olives, Crusader army listens to a speech by Peter the Hermit, and he exhorts the Crusader armies, the four armies, to put aside their differences and exhorts them to take the city. And as a result, the Crusader armies come together, and on July 13th, 1099, the great assault, the final assault, happens. And of course the cry rises up from the Crusader army, God wills it, just like it did at Clermont 3.5 years before. After 2 days of continuous fighting, a lieutenant of Godfrey of Bouillon pierces through one of the walls of Jerusalem, and suddenly Godfrey's army pours into the streets of Jerusalem. They open the gates. The rest of the other three Crusader armies pour into the city, and Jerusalem falls, probably within minutes. Here I should probably mention, I mean, I go into this in more detail when we do the whole course on the Crusades, but I'll just mention briefly here. One of the reasons the First Crusade has kind of perhaps a poor reputation today is not because of anything that happened up to this point, but because of what happened in the next 8 to 12 hours after the Crusaders pierced the walls. Basically, they slaughtered all the Muslims, even ones who were surrendering at that point. They slaughtered quite a few of the Jews also, which wasn't in the original battle plan. Accounts at the time said there were places where the blood was up to people's ankles. So there was a general slaughter that occurred after they took Jerusalem. Now, we should also say that this was not an unusual occurrence if we look at warfare in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. It's not like the Crusader army was the first one that slaughtered the other army when they took over, but this happened. Godfrey of Bouillon, which is sometimes Englishized into Geoffrey. Godfrey of Bouillon is elected the ruler of Jerusalem, and they want to make him king. And he refuses to be made king, so they make him like first administrative officer or some, I forget what the title was. He refused to be king because he said there's only one king of Jerusalem, who is
Jesus Christ.
Jesus. Now his brother would happily accept the title of king after his death, but when Godfrey was voted the ruler of Jerusalem, he did not accept the title of king. So this is the first great hero of the Crusades. If you look at all 8 of the Crusades and some of the various figures who would be famous, Godfrey of Bouillon on the western side is probably the second most famous. I would say he was probably eclipsed only by the Third Crusade by Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lion. Godfrey would only rule for a year until he died. His brother, Baldwin I, succeeded him in 1100 and was happy to accept the kingship. It's good to be king, and if it's good to be king, it's great to be king of Jerusalem, which would have been considered the center of the world at that time. This, I will let you admire this. Ooh, wow. This is an engraving of the tomb of Godfrey of Bouillon. I just wanted you to admire the fact that I had such a...
Where is it?
It no longer exists. It was torn down by the Muslims when they retook Jerusalem. I don't know why. Why would the Muslims tear down Godfrey? It's a historical. On August 12th, the Crusader armies won a huge victory at Ascalon. At this point, they essentially control the Holy Lands all the way down from the Turkish border. They have, what today is Syria and Lebanon, and what we call Israel. At this point, the Crusader armies had taken back the Holy Lands. After the Crusader armies took back the Holy Lands, most of them went home, back to France, and woohoo, and received garlands and roses and all that. So the force that was left behind was pretty small, and they were completely surrounded by hostile, battle-hardened Muslim forces. And eventually, a cycle went through of the Muslims seized Jerusalem back, and then they lost it again, and this cycle went on for quite a while. The Knights Templars were formed 10, 15 years after this to protect people pilgrims going from Western Europe to the Holy Lands, and of course, in time, they became the greatest fighting force in the history of Christendom. There would be 7 more Crusades. The third one is, oddly enough, the most famous one, simply because Richard the Lionhearted got really ticked off that the Crusader armies had lost all the Holy Lands again, and he pours into the Holy Lands with a vast army and takes over all of the Holy Lands, except he gets to the gates of Jerusalem and he gets a text message. He gets a text message from England that says, your rotten brother is trying to seize the crown from you. You better get back here. And Richard the Lionhearted leaves and goes back to England, and Jerusalem stays in Muslim hands until Frederick II in the Sixth Crusade. Eventually, the Muslims take back all of the Holy Lands. The final battle is in Acre in 1291, where the vast Crusader castle there, which is defended by the Knights Templar, finally falls to the Muslims. And this is the end of the Crusade.